Hello, everyone. I'm Madeline Greenberg, Communications Associate at Campaign Legal Center. Welcome to today's Campaign Legal Conversation, the fight to abolish felony disenfranchisement. CLC is a national nonpartisan organization working to advance democracy through law at the federal, state, and local levels. We fight for every American's right to participate in the democratic process. Before we start our discussion, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items. During the conversation, please use the comment section on LinkedIn or YouTube to submit your questions for members of the panel. At the end of the panel, we will start the Q&A section. We will do our best to get to every question, but in the interest of time, we may not be able to answer all of them. If we're not able to answer your question today and you're a member of the press, please email your questions to media@campaignlegal.org. If you're a member of the public and we're not able to answer your question today, please email info@campaignlegal.org. Moderating today's discussion is Campaign Legal Center's own Yeshua Downey. Yeshua is an organizer on Campaign Legal Center's Restore Your Vote team. He is a passionate advocate for social justice and voting rights with a background in political campaign organizing and a focus on community engagement. As a freelance photographer and videographer, Yeshua uses his creative talents to amplify marginalized voices and address critical issues. He is dedicated to CLC's missions of restoring voting rights and abolishing felony disenfranchisement. Yeshua, take it away.
Thanks, Madeline. Felony disenfranchisement is an anchor for racist voter suppression, a relic of slavery-era punishment that, till this day, still strips millions of people of political power and their duty to their community. It was created to and still serves to silence people who have been criminalized, disproportionately Black and brown, and keep them locked out of democracy. Campaign Legal Center's Restore Your Vote team has been working alongside clients, partners, and affected individuals in states across the country, some of whom you'll hear from shortly, to fight back against felony disenfranchisement and help those in their communities restore their freedom to vote. The Restore Your Vote team has provided direct rights restoration services to thousands of individuals, giving over $1 million in grants. We partner with thousands of community leaders to advance the rights restoration process in their states. We've helped tens of thousands of people who have used our online restoreyourvote.org website and told the stories of people we've assisted in spreading the word that just because you have a felony conviction, it does not necessarily mean that you cannot vote. We're excited to jump into a conversation with community leaders who are leading the fight to end felony disenfranchisement in states across the country. Now, I would like to take a moment to introduce today's panel. We have Celinda Geredo. She's a grassroots human rights organizer and mother of 6 based in Albuquerque, New Mexico. With over 30 years of movement building experience, Celinda is deeply rooted in abolitionist, anti-racist, and intersectional justice work that centers the leadership of directly impacted people. Her organizing home is with Millions for Prisoners New Mexico, part of a national movement to abolish modern-day slavery by supporting incarcerated organizers across the country. Her work is grounded in an understanding of how state violence intersects with generational poverty, displacement, and systemic barriers to housing, education, employment, and healthcare. Anthony Blankenship is the senior community organizer with Civil Survival in the Policy and Advocacy Department. In his role at Civil Survival, Anthony helps to connect and empower people that have been impacted by the criminal legal system to build their collective and individual political power in Washington state. Since being released from prison, Anthony has been working to undo the harms created by the criminal legal system and hold systems accountable to those they serve with a focus on mental advocacy, voting rights, and ending solitary confinement. We also have Sheba Williams, born and raised in Richmond, Virginia. She founded a nonprofit, No Left Turns, in 2016. The organization was born to be a support system for those impacted by mass incarceration, but quickly evolved into a day-to-day fight for removing the policies and stigmas around a past conviction. Thank you to the members of the panel for joining us today for what I'm sure will be a very interesting conversation. Let's jump right in. But today we also wanted to share some words by Alamine Patterson, a community leader who is incarcerated currently. Alamine Patterson was born and raised in Boston, Massachusetts, and he is a co-founder of the Empowering Descendant Communities to Unlock Democracy Project. He is the former chairman of the African American Coalition Committee from 2020 to 2023 and longstanding director of its Voting Rights Initiative. He was not able to join us live today, but he shared thoughts for us to read out loud. Quote, this is his quote: "I think that being able to vote and being in a position to have a say in the community that I helped harm in the past means a lot because I feel like I can take the initiative to help improve my community now. That right there is a major indication that someone is unlikely to return to the community and further harm it. When we want to participate in voting, there is an outcry as if because we made a mistake in the past, we don't care about our community. The bad choices we made weren't made in a vacuum. Many of us were either harmed by or in our community first. We rebelled when we were young, but now after being in prison, we've matured. We do whatever it is we need to find healing. And once we do find that maturity and that healing, oftentimes a lot of us want to give back. But then we find ourselves in a situation where being incarcerated makes it incredibly difficult to do that. When we cast ballots, we intend to make a positive change. Voting is a form of reparations. We can utilize our right to vote to help repair our community. But because we can't vote while incarcerated, it makes it that much more difficult to bring about lasting reforms that are needed in our community." End quote. In Massachusetts, individuals only lose the right to vote while incarcerated for a felony conviction, and the right to vote is automatically restored upon release from incarceration. As a result, there's nearly 5,000 people who are denied the right to vote because they're incarcerated. However, Massachusetts used to be one of just a few states to never take away the right to vote at all. But in 2000, voters approved a ballot initiative to remove this right and disenfranchise people while serving time. The ballot initiative had been introduced by then Governor Paul Cellucci after incarcerated voters began politically organizing and had even started a political action committee. Now, Massachusetts is working to undo that step backward. For the last several years, the Massachusetts coalition called Empowering Descendant Communities, which Alamine helps lead, has been working with state legislators to introduce a bill that would end felony disenfranchisement. The coalition is currently in the middle of a multi-year effort to advance that bill and change the Massachusetts Constitution. Now, turning to the rest of our panelists, abolishing felony disenfranchisement is an extremely important and urgent demand. I want to know, how did you all first come into this fight, and what made y'all realize that it's a system that needs to be abolished, not just reformed? Sheba, I'll start with you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Shiva Williams. I am in the state of Virginia, and we are an outlier in the nation where our voting rights are stripped away permanently, and they can only be reinstated by the sitting governor. So one individual has the power to determine who gets their rights back. This has been a long-standing fight in our state to change our constitution, because in 1902, following the vestige of Jim Crow and trying to take away democracy from newly freed slaves, felony disenfranchisement was put into our Constitution. It was an effort specifically to keep Black people from voting. So we know that. And over the past decade or so, our organization, along with a ton of partners, have worked to change the Constitution by removing felony disenfranchisement. While the past three governors have reinstated the rights of over 300,000 Virginians, this last administration shined a blinding light on the fact that the power is held in one person's hands. And he got to determine if he would reinstate people's rights. They would deny people without any information or cause. There is no criteria, no concrete criteria that says whether or not you'll get your rights back, when you'll get them back, or if you'll get them back. And our organization, along with Fair Election Centers, filed a lawsuit in 2023 just because there was no criteria. So the fluctuation between administration to administration and a person's grace and will led us to have complete understanding that this shouldn't be a position that is determined by one person. I lost my rights back in 2004. And even though I was only sentenced to 5 years of probation, I was disenfranchised for 9 years due to inability to afford restitution. So we're talking about a modern day poll tax. We're talking about people having unequal access to the ballot box. And we're talking about giving the power to one individual. And because we have one-term limits in our governorship, it can change from person to person.
Thank you. Celinda, you want to follow up? Same question. How did you come into this fight, and what made you realize that the system needs to be abolished and not just reformed?
I've been fortunate to be networked with people and support people who are behind the walls, who are prisoners across the United States, doing this work for quite some time. In 2016, 2017, we were organizing 1 million people to march on Washington, D.C. in the names of prisoners' rights. This was why it's called Millions for Prisoners. In those demands that were brought from behind the walls, one of the most present demands was the right to vote, the right to democracy. And so we felt our job as organizers, as those who can carry power with alongside our people behind the walls, was to help to advocate on the outside. And so we made that one of our North Stars in our work. And so we introduced our first bill to abolish felony disenfranchisement in voting in New Mexico in 2019. And we have continued to push for this. In 2023, we got a little bit further. In New Mexico in 2019, you had to, just like Sheba noted, you had to complete everything, all fines and fees, restitution, all probation and parole to be eligible again. And it did also require somebody to go into the clerk's office with their discharge certificate, which also was another additional barrier put in place. And so in 2023, our new bill says, so long as you're not in a DOC prison facility, you're eligible to vote. Unfortunately, the state has not complied, and so we are in litigation right now, still fighting for voting rights for our people.
So much, Celinda. Anthony, let's hear your story. How'd you?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great question, and for me, I lost my right to vote when I went to prison, and while I was there, I started pulling that thread. I started to read. I started to educate myself on Black history, our American history. And I came out, and I was hungry, and I was also very disenfranchised, right? I could not vote. I did not feel like I had a voice. And it was actually some other people at Civil Survival, who I currently work for, that put me on game. That was like, we're in this fight. We're trying to, restore the right to vote for people that are currently incarcerated. But in order to get there, we got to get the people who are on community custody, like me at the time, their right to vote. And so I jumped into this fight, and we've been pushing, hard ever since. We were able to win, pass a bill to allow people to vote as soon as they get out of prison. But for me, like, when I realized the system needed to be abolished, it was that was why I was emotionally disenfranchised prior to, being criminally disenfranchised, because I never at all thought that voting was a path to power, right? And or that my voice was ever going to matter in a system. And it's why vote for our oppressors? That is the question that we ask ourselves. Why does our vote matter? And I know that we'll probably get into that, but that's really what got me into this fight, was other people pulling me in, trying to educate me when I was hard-headed and thinking, nah, like, this ain't it. I would rather be outside the system than be working within it, right? So that's kind of how I got to this fight and continue to push, for my people on the inside.
Absolutely. Thanks, everybody. Yeah, I think it's really important to share our story and remember why we got into this fight, and remind other folks how we started. I know me, I'm one of the many people who also thought that I didn't have the right to vote ever after I got my felony conviction. So it came a long way to where I'm at now. So, but thanks everyone for that answer. I do have a question. What do you say to people who say, well, I'm all for second chances, but not for people who've been convicted of very serious crimes? So I don't mind a little felony disenfranchisement. Celinda, you want to start with this one?
Yeah, I think this is really important for us to unpack as an entire society. Because to get to the root of felony disenfranchisement is, as Sheba and Anthony have already alluded to, is felony disenfranchisement is a badge and incident. It falls under legally a badge and incident of slavery. And so we have to connect it to its root to understand why it's being weaponized against certain communities. And so to understand what badges and incidents of slavery is to go roll all the way back. And so when we think about what is a badge of slavery is, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, people who were enslaved or were considered property had to carry a lantern. It was called lantern laws to identify themselves as property. Today, we have things like ankle monitoring in the community that shows that you are still custody of the state. And so these are what we refer to as badges of slavery. Incidents of slavery is like the Dred Scott decision, by the Supreme Court. And so when we think about what these badges and incidents are, felony disenfranchisement is birthed out of that loophole in the 13th Amendment that says you are still enslaved so long as you have been convicted of a crime. And so they are allowed under that loophole in the 13th Amendment that did not free everybody, because it allowed that provision for people who have been convicted of a crime to still be subjected to these slavery badges and incidents. And so we need to, as a society, unpack and unlearn what we have been taught in colonization, to understand that this is acceptable. It's acceptable for some people to be treated as enslaved. It's acceptable for slavery to still exist in the United States. Disenfranchisement is just one of the elements that's still present that we have to fight against. But it is one of the most present because as we see the conditions that we are in, the power of our democracy is deteriorating. And so the more people that they are able to disenfranchise, right, alludes to more power of the ruling class. And so this is really, really important for us to understand the root, that this has nothing to do with criminality. Nobody is standing before a sentencing judge and is told, you're going to go to prison for 10 years. You're going to have 5 years probation afterwards, and you lose your right to vote. That does not happen. And that's not part of the sentencing structure. It's never articulated as somebody is going through the criminal legal system. There's almost never a conversation that tells somebody that they're going to lose their right to vote. So this connection to criminality is a farce, and we have to treat it as such because there is no connection to criminality and voting.
Thank you, Celinda. Absolutely. Connecting to the roots and highlighting where it all came from and connecting it to what's going on today. I think that's very important to note. Anthony, what do you say to someone who doesn't mind a little bit of felony disenfranchisement due to some very serious crimes?
Yeah, I mean, we had this conversation, Yeshua, with someone as we're standing in the rain a couple weekends ago, right, in Chicago. What I would tell that person, right, is, and I guess for a little bit of background, we actually had to kill our bill to allow people. They were trying to add amendments on it that would carve out certain groups, people with sex offenses, people who have committed crimes of murder, right? And we had to kill our bill. So because we did not want carve outs, we wanted everybody to vote. We wanted to stick to our values. And so we had to face this, right? We had to face this criticism time and time again when talking to legislators, when talking to people in the community. But voting is one of the most pro-social behaviors that someone can do. I would ask them, how did it feel the first time that you voted? What did that feel like? Was it a good feeling? Did you feel connected to your community? And then I think someone said it best was, nobody's ever robbed a grocery store with a ballot, right? Like you ain't causing harm by voting. You are showing that you care about your community, that you care about the people around you, that you are educating yourself, even if it is just during that voting period, to understand who has power over you. So that's what I would start with. I think it is always a conversation, right? You want them to engage. You want them to feel that they're being heard, and then hit them with like, well, I've been to prison too. Are you telling me that I should not be able to vote, right? What separates me? I am no. I'm not better than anybody else or no worse than anybody else. I'm here standing right next to you, so you can tell me I should not be able to.
Right. Touching on the empathy. We're all human. Sheba, coming to you. I'm sure you've heard this a lot in Virginia.
Well, it's universal across the world.
Yeah.
If we're talking about people living without sin, one sin is greater than the other. But I'm gonna get into my nerd brain and let y'all know, like 1 in 3 adults in the United States has some sort of record. 1 in 7 in Virginia is disenfranchised because of a felony conviction. 95% or more people come home from Department of Corrections at some time. Those are our neighbors, our brothers and sisters, our parents, our siblings, and in my case, like it's very personal when people say violent versus nonviolent, this offense versus that offense, because no one is perfect. No one is above sin. Like, both of my parents were arrested when I was 10 years old, and they were charged with a violent crime. And in 1989, there was no other crime committed since that point. But at the end of the day, when we look at like right now how life has evolved, and we talk about like care and support for people who have substance use disorder, my parents got handcuffs. So the first thing is there's an evolution of the human brain, and we have to think about humanity. We have to think about the fact that we're talking about people, and if we're going to judge people by their crime, we're gonna get into like the work. Like, my organization is a direct service organization, and we work with individuals leaving long-term incarceration. The great majority of people who we work with have what we call violent convictions, right? They reoffend the least. They do not return to prison, and they're actually pouring back into the communities that they once caused harm in. I would put them up against anybody to say, yes, we've made mistakes, but this is what we're doing to rectify that mistake. But at the end of the day, the right to vote, like Anthony said, is not something that should be taken as a pawn and held in front of somebody's face to say, you get this back if you're this level of good or bad. We're talking about people who are paying taxes, who are working, who have children, who have parents, who have to make decisions about everything in their life. We're talking about how much minimum wage may be. We're talking about who gets access to free lunch or healthcare or what have you. We are sitting out a population of the people and say, your mistake is worse than this person's mistake. And for that, we will forever deem you as irresponsible and not able to have a voice in the very decisions that are made about your life and your livelihood. So, I'm gonna fight this every time, because not just my parents, my best friend who just came home after 27 years, my ex-partner, all of the friends that work with me alongside this work have these convictions that are considered irredeemable, but they show up the most, they protect the most, and they go back to prison the least. So we don't get to discriminate in our work. And I advise people to like educate themselves about who people really are, because I hear a lot, you don't look like the type, and I don't know what the type looks like, because inability to have access to resources can plague anybody, especially in this climate.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sheba. Just taking that in. All great answers from everybody. Thanks so much. You're right, Anthony. That conversation is what inspired that question. So happy to bring that to it. Celinda, I want to come to you. Props to the work that you all have been doing in New Mexico, restoring voting rights to people on parole and probation. But the fight didn't stop when that bill passed in 2023. You want to speak on the lessons that we've learned of what happened after? And you mentioned the deeper roots. So did that reveal anything about the deeper roots of the felony disenfranchisement systems?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's this false notion in our country that somehow Republicans are the conservative capitalist focused party, but the truth is both parties are wings on the same bird. And here in New Mexico, we are considered a super blue progressive state. We have a governor who's a Democrat, and our full legislature is democratically controlled for many years now. And so the idea that fixing this problem should be easy if you're dealing with Democrats or people who call themselves progressives. What we quickly learned is that after 2019, when we first introduced the bill, the first things that started to come up was when I was speaking the truth about how this is a badge and incident of slavery and where it's rooted from, that this doesn't have anything to do with criminality. The first pushback I got was from progressive Democrats who said, stop talking about slavery. You're stigmatizing everybody in the community. And I said, well, we can't have this conversation without discussing where it comes from, because then we allow for this conversation about criminality, which is not true at all. And then we started to see all the false allies. So as we built a lot of political power to move our bill forward, false allies started to come along, whether they were in the nonprofits or PACs or lobbyists, started to come along and show up. And what we learned very quickly there is that there were forces that were even outside of the state that were funding initiatives to block our bill or to compromise our bill. Our original bill was to end disenfranchisement, period. And instead, we got this watered down version of, which we're happy to take steps forward, but it was a compromise to just say, okay, people who are in prison are not allowed to vote. But if now if you're on probation and parole, you're able to vote. And so they're still trying to do these carve outs with our community members, which is not acceptable to us. You've heard the other panelists speak to this, that all of us belong. It doesn't matter where in the criminal legal system we are, we all belong. And so we ended up in this compromise where, it got across the finish line. And then we found ourselves with state representatives who call themselves progressive Democrats who would not implement the bill. So they continued to disenfranchise. They never updated the language, even on their very own state's website, to say that voting rights had been expanded. They still continued to send denial letters to people who should have been eligible. And we ended up having to be enter litigation against the state of New Mexico to insist that they follow the law that had been passed in 2023. And through this process, we have been able to unveil many people in the nonprofit industrial complex, like I said, lobbyists and PACs, who were actually working collectively with Democrats in our state who were blocking access to the ballot. Because we also know that in a place where everybody is eligible to vote, even conservative Democrats don't exist, because our people are able to see through their politic. And so that's what we're up against here in New Mexico. And we're still in active litigation right now. We're still under a stay. We're still trying to move things forward. And now we're still having to do negotiations with the Department of Corrections and the Secretary of State to even identify how people are able to get access to the ballot, or how people are able to register when they are leaving prison. And so there's still all of these logistical issues that one would have thought would have been in place even before we advanced the bill. They had never even thought about enfranchising our people. And so, our fight continues, but I think it definitely helps us to see more clearly and to really look at who is around us when we are building our power, who are the false allies, and to hold them accountable, as well as politicians who are grandstanding for a bill, but then never care about the implementation. And so we're in the accountability phase right now here in New Mexico.
Accountability is definitely key. Thank you for that answer. Anthony, I'm coming to you. Washington, also often seen as a progressive state, but people with convictions still face major barriers. What are the key strategies that you're proud of and that's pushed Washington forward, and which still needs to be torn down?
Yeah, great question. And Celinda, I'll just say, the Jim Crows and the Black Codes are, you don't even know how deeply rooted our current laws are, in like because of the court decisions, because they're just hidden in our laws so much that we don't think about it, right? The fact is that during the Reconstruction era, there were over 2,000, Black men who held office during that time, and then when around the time that criminal disenfranchisement became a thing, um, that number dwindled all the way down to there were 16 people in the U.S. Congress, and it took 100 years for them to get a single vote or a single, representation again. So that's a lot of work. And as far as Washington State goes, and what I'm proud of, it is not the passage of the bill. I mean, it is that. It is undoing history, it is all of that. But really, what it comes down to, as Celinda talked about, is implementation. It is actually getting those individuals out there that have been criminally disenfranchised voting. We had to face, as you said, we sound progressive. Seattle, you hear about Washington, all you hear is, Seattle being progressive, but, east side of the mountains is KKK land, right? Like that is the heartland of it, Eastern Washington and Idaho. And so we're not as progressive as it seems, right? We do have the trifecta here. So, we do have that going for us. But, when we tried to go register voters in Spokane County Jail, one of the commissioners, we had a $2.5 million grant to be able to go into to the jails and get them registered to vote. And this was working with the auditors. And the commissioner, flat out said, we don't want people in jail voting, even though they legally could vote, because they're not going to vote for us, right? And that's not even true. That's not even true. There are so many Republicans that are behind bars, and we just think that, and conservatives and people who want to be seen as tough on crime behind bars, right? Voters come in so many different ways. So, I think just being able to implement, being able to work with the Secretary of State's office to work on things, changing the websites is a slow, hard, tedious process, and you have to be on them, because each county jail, each court, each system has their own, they have to update it all. So, and then, we went from 400 to 2,000, people voting, once they were released in a matter of a year. And I think we're up around 6,000 people now, and so just that number of individuals who have gotten out, and that is just a small portion of the numbers that we can, collect. But that is huge, and so being able to just let people know. We went in, I think actually, the last thing I'll say is, one of the small things around this piece of legislation was that it did not take into account people or, youth in prison who, because it was anybody who's under Department of Corrections is disenfranchised. And so our youth are under a whole different set or department. And so we're able to go into the youth prisons who have committed the same crimes as adults, and register them to vote. And that in itself is a huge win, because we do have people who are locked up that are voting, and that we're able to educate, and we're able to go deep with them and talk about civic engagement, and hopefully each one teach one, right? Hopefully we can build on that, and we can stop that just historical disenfranchisement that comes through the generations of people being incarcerated or just being left out of a system.
You're muted.
Thanks for that. Thanks, Sheba. Thanks for that answer, Anthony, and also pointing out about those websites being updated. I've seen that across the country. A lot of misinformation, and government websites have the either the law or the guidance around restoring voting rights just incorrect, and it is tough to get that fixed. So, thanks everyone. I'm going to go. Let's see. I want to ask, what advice can you all give others that are looking to abolish felony disenfranchisement in their states? What strategies and tactics are proven successful across the country that can be leveraged nationwide? And anyone, Sheba, you want to start with this?
So we're fighting for this constitutional amendment, and in Virginia, it's a 2-year process. It has to be passed twice with the same language. It has to go in between. Election has to be in between, and then it goes on the ballot for the voters to decide. The biggest thing, the most important thing, is community education, because there are a lot of people who see those referendums on the ballot and don't know what it is. They will ignore it. They will, vote whatever they think. So education has been key. But like in our state, even though we are horrible on restoration of rights in our state, there were a lot of different tactics that were used to make sure that people could make this happen. We had lawmakers who had the tenacity to put bills in place that will protect the current process as the process is under attack. Like our Attorney General removed us from the ERIC system, which is our voter list maintenance system. And there were bills put in place to protect that process, because this administration unfortunately did a ton of voter purges. In November of 2023, a week before the election, 3,400 people were removed from the voter rolls due to technical violations, which are not new laws, which was illegal, right? It was something that was done, and they say, oh, the last administration did that, but we all know what it is. 6,303 people were removed the next year based on naturalization and citizenship because of a glitch in a DMV system. So we had to get the information out. You can send postcards, you can speak to people who are the unlikely benefactors of the information, because we can speak to people who get it all day. We got to start speaking to people who know nothing about felony disenfranchisement as a whole. So show up at schools, show up at colleges when they're doing voter registration drives, encourage people to incorporate restoration of rights into the conversation, making sure that lawmakers are able to do things like, we have a Voting Rights Act in Virginia, and that was critical in making sure that we had same-day voter registration. So when the people were purged from the rolls, they could still go back and vote that election with 24-hour turnaround notice. It was critical that we had more time for people, 45 days from an election for people to do early voting, no excuse absentee ballots. Like, different padding was put into our legislation to make sure that there were protections well before like all of these civil rights attacks were kind of trickling down. We see that we have a few lawsuits in our state. NAACP statewide conference sued in state court. They were not successful, but they sued, and they kind of mirrored the lawsuit that we have in federal court with Fair Election Center. And for people who don't know, my dad, who was disenfranchised in 1989 and did not vote for 35 years, in an attempt to moot the lawsuit, the governor gave him his voting rights back. But we have another plaintiff who was denied over and over again. So that lawsuit is in appeals. And then ACLU of Virginia and one of my colleagues who is watching are the benefactors, like are the lawsuit litigants in a case that challenges the Readmission Act. So being creative about all of the different ways that we address these things, voting in jails before people are convicted is critical. Making sure that the demographic of people who have nothing to do with felony disenfranchisement are standing in the gaps when people cannot vote. Because what we see is a lot of people showing up to rallies and fighting and testifying in General Assembly for these laws to change, who don't have access to the vote. But we also got to lean on those people that do have access to the vote. We absolutely have to have education around those who can vote and do vote, because the percentage of people who sit out elections is huge, right? We have to reach that demographic who may not know anything about felony disenfranchisement and educate them about what's coming, not just on this constitutional amendment, but in small pieces of legislation, because everybody goes for the jugular, right? We talk about the constitutional amendment, but we had to put some things in place in the interim. We had to have education. We had to have literature around what these processes were, and specifically, what the history of felony disenfranchisement is in our state, and educating legislators. Like, a lot of people think if there are legislators in position that they are omniscient and they know all the things. They had to be educated about the process as well. In 2021, 69,045 individuals were on probation and got their rights back because at a 7 a.m. privileges and elections meeting, I had to let individuals know that my ex-husband was on indefinite probation. There were lawmakers and even our Secretary of State at the time that did not know that there was indefinite probation, which meant that a parole officer controlled when my ex would be able to vote, and thousands of other people. Now, Virginia got 350,000 people who are disenfranchised in this moment. So we have to be creative about it. But those are some tactics and some strategies that people can kind of get into that are smaller bites from the apple versus going like super big, but also go super big.
Thank you so much, Shiva. Education, super important. Definitely agree. Public education, like you said, even educating the legislators, the administration. So, I mean, there's been times we've called elections departments and they had some information wrong. So education all across the board. Thank you. Celinda, you want to answer the same question? Of
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Shiva. And I think like great minds think alike. I think we've all been thinking about jail-based voting and how important that is to start helping to bring civics education to folks that are system impacted, justice impacted folks. So we have an Unlock Civics curriculum that we've been developing that we're modeling after the work that's been done in Chicago, where they have gone into the Cook County Jail and they're using the Unlock Civics curriculum to enfranchise people that are there, justice impacted people. And I, with that note too, I just want to acknowledge that people who are justice impacted have not always gone through the process of being convicted of a felony. Some people are generational, as Sheba spoke about. Her father was disenfranchised. I've worked with community members in rural New Mexico who are indigenous, and their people for generations had been disenfranchised. And so they had never thought about voting. They just believed that they didn't have access or that it wasn't for them because their father and their grandfather were convicted of a felony. So now the youth don't know that they have access to the ballot. And so when we think about the impacts on these communities, on justice impacted communities, and the way disenfranchisement flows through our communities, it's about taking away self-advocacy. So this is not just about voting. Like what's happening with disenfranchisement is much, much deeper than that. And that is what the true intent and why we connect it to badges and incidents of slavery. Because what it does is it removes our opportunity to self-advocate for ourselves. So we see many people who enter the criminal legal system who never thought about voting because the generations before them never had access. And so by the time they're 30 or 40 years old coming out of prison, it's not one of the things that's a top priority for them, which is why we have to start in juvenile detention centers. We have to start in our own neighborhoods where people might have access to the ballot and not even know it. They may have had a case where, they were charged with a felony and they believed that they couldn't vote, but the outcome of their case actually ended with some kind of a deferment or something else that made them eligible. And so helping people to understand the way these systems work within each other is really important. And I'm so happy to hear Anthony mention emotional disenfranchisement, because that's what this is all about. It's about this idea that this system is not for us, that we don't have a voice in it. And it goes much deeper than that. It's about our ability to go to the city council and make public comments so that we can have potholes filled and, street lights in our own community. And along with tactics and educating many people, one of the first people I practiced on was Deb Haaland. And she was a congressional candidate back then. She went all the way up to a high-level secretary seat within the Biden administration. So you never know what seeds you're planting with whom and where. That's why these conversations are really, really important to have all the time, everywhere, so that we can continue to break down these barriers. And so, yeah, let's just keep remembering also that it is much deeper. It's about self-advocacy. And the more that us as a community learn self-advocacy early on, the less likely we are to be disenfranchised.
Thank you, Celinda. Love that answer. Anthony, I want to give you a chance to answer this question as well. And then we're going to go, I want to read some closing thoughts. I want to read a quote from Alamine Patterson to close out. But the question, if just to repeat it for the audience, what advice can you give others looking to abolish felony disenfranchisement in their states? And what strategies and tactics are proving successful across the country that can be leveraged nationwide?
Yeah, so I'm gonna give a shout out to Saul Alinsky. If you ever hear this, reach out to me, brother. I want to learn from you. But what he says is make the enemy live up to their own rule book, right? And so in Tennessee and other places, what they did was they used the word infamous crime or moral turpitude, and then they expanded it broadly, right? And so in Washington, and thanks, to CLC for working with us on this, we're using the enemy tactics to constrict that use, right? And so in Washington, we have a bill to end criminal disenfranchisement by attaching it to the death penalty, which is abolished in Washington for everything but treason. And so what we're trying to do is, and nobody's been, charged with treason or sentenced to treason in Washington, I don't know how long. So, our tactic, therefore, is to use that enemy's rule book in our favor, right? They've already done it across other country or in other states, right? So we might as well use their tactics that they're continuing to push to harm our folks and our people and restrict our access to voting rights, to civic education. Let's use that against them, right? For every talking point that they say about why we shouldn't, that is the same talking point that we need to be telling our people who are disenfranchised why we should. We do this because they don't want us to, right? We vote because they don't want us to vote. And that's really what the tactics come down to, is doing everything, be a contrarian on everything that is going to restrict our rights. And we have power, as Sheba said, 1 in 7. That's a lot of power. 350,000 people. If 350,000 people unite, millions for prisoners. If we're able to get those millions for prisoners to actually unite around change, and that's exactly what we're trying to do. But it is impossibly hard to do because it is oftentimes we're no longer carrying that lantern around, right? There is no scarlet letter that you have to, that's on your chest. It looks different for everybody. And so we don't know who is and who hasn't been impacted, or we don't know who's been, incarcerated, but we know who's been impacted. Every single person, has been impacted by this. Lastly, I'll say is, I have a couple uncles that have green eyes and both their parents are Black. What does that say? What does that say about our history and where we've come from when we're talking about who has these rights and who should and should not have power, right? We are survivors, and we're going to continue to survive. And we're continue to push, and it is only a matter of time before everybody is going to be able to vote. It's either you get on board now or you get off, because it is. I mean, racism is a sinking ship, right? Hop off and come on to this side. It's much greener. So I'll end with that.
Thank you. No, thanks so much, you all. We have to educate. We have to unite. Hold them accountable, the legislators. Thanks to everyone for this deep, important, thoughtful conversation. I'm I'm going to close out with a quote from Alamine Patterson. We asked them, how do you stay motivated when the fight to end felony disenfranchisement can take years or even decades? So, and I quote, "It is very difficult to stay motivated over the long term. I think it becomes more difficult if our drive for doing this work is solely to get a win. If our focus is only to end felony disenfranchisement in Massachusetts, that puts a lot of pressure on us, because if we don't succeed at that goal, then we may feel like we failed. Having successes along the way is important, but it's important to frame what a success is. Being able to have incarcerated people be leaders in this work is a success. And having them be compensated for the work they do, that's another success. Getting 100 people to turn out at an event, another success. Sometimes we overlook the many successes we have, and we need to be mindful not to take for granted the things we're doing, because some of the things we're doing are not happening everywhere. Our perception becomes reality oftentimes, and how we perceive winning is important. How we perceive losing is important. I perceive winning as creating a model that allows people to do this work in a way that doesn't bring about more harm, regardless of whether we achieve the end goal or not. People are able to maintain their honor and their dignity. The real win is building community, promoting healing in the process of the struggle to reach our end goal. The real win is building community and promoting healing in the process of the struggle to reach our end goal. Thank you, everyone. Let's make sure we keep this conversation going. I think, Madeline, are you?
Yes, thank you all so much for joining us for this conversation today. If you have any additional questions or would like more information, please email us at info@campaignlegalcenter.org. Thank you so much again to our speakers for all that you do and for joining us today. And everyone, have a great rest of your day.
One last thing, for those that are watching that want to get more information on laws in any state around restoring voting rights, restoreyourvote.org is another great resource. You can answer yes or no questions about felony disenfranchisement, and then it'll give you more information about how to get your voting rights restored in that state. Thank you.